Hello, kia ora, everybody. Welcome to our exclusive virtual gathering featuring our good friend John Mark Comer. I am Strahan Coleman. I am going to be your host today for this next hour, talking about practicing the way and having a dialogue with John Mark. For those of you who don't know me or haven't met me, I am an author. I'm a writer, poet, and a musician from Aotearoa, New Zealand, right down in the corner of the world where all good things come from, Little Hobbiton. Hopefully you've heard of it. I'm also the writer of a book called Beholding, which is about deepening our experience in God, which is what I've given my life to, and my heart is as a spiritual director and a retreat leader to help people know God. So you can imagine how excited I am to be here talking about a book that is just so profoundly impactful for us as a generation in that space. I want to start by saying thank you. Thank you so much for being a part of this launch team, for your dedication and your commitment to spreading the message of this book, Practicing the Way. And I'm really excited. I know you must be. The team is excited to have this conversation with John Mark, for you guys to hear a little bit about his story, his feelings on it, and even answer some of your pre-submitted questions. So for the next hour, you can expect to hear a little bit of conversation between John Mark and I. I have some questions for him, and then some of you have pre-submitted some questions, which I'm going to ask. And God willing, at the end of that, we are going to do some live Q&A as well. So you'll see down the bottom of your screen, if you kind of take your cursor down there, a little box that says Q&A, and you can head to that box and add any questions in there that you would like to submit for that time. So I can see some of you have already done that. So make sure you put it in there and not the chat box. Just a couple of housekeeping things before we get going. Firstly, as you're already doing, drop down in the chat box. We'd love to hear where you're calling in from and just share your thoughts as we go, things that are inspiring you from this conversation that John Mark says that kind of really speak to you. You're welcome to talk there with others. Just ask that you keep that respectful in the chat. Also, for your convenience, Waterbrook has enabled closed captions. So you'll see down the bottom, there's another little box icon with a CC there. If you click on that at the bottom of your screen, you'll be able to kind of see those closed captions. They're not perfect, they're auto-generated, so just kind of bear with us in that space too. If you would like additional copies of Practicing the Way, Waterbrook will also put a link down there in the chat, so keep an eye out for that. And finally, if you missed part of this conversation for some reason, you got to go, fear not. We are recording it, and we will send out a link after this chat for your convenience, so you can catch up with it. Ka pai? Wonderful. Okay, so many of you, of course, are familiar with John Mark as the founding pastor of Bridgetown Church in Portland, Oregon. He is also the founder and the teacher of Practicing the Way, which is a non-profit crafting spiritual formation resources for churches and small groups, learning how to become apprentices in the way of Jesus. Beautiful resources, as I'm sure you've all seen. John Mark is the author of the best-selling book, The Ruthless Elimination of Hurry. He is the New York Times bestseller, author of Live No Lies, and now, thanks to you in a big way as well, the New York Times and USA Today bestseller, Practicing the Way. So with all that in mind, let's collectively just give a warm welcome to the one, the only,
Strahan,
John Mark Comer.
Stop right now. You were doing so well. You were doing so well. This is
How
so
are you,
silly.
man?
Hi, my dear friend. I'm just going to ignore everything you just said and just express my delight to see your face as always.
Oh, thanks, bro.
My heart is
It would
so,
be impossible to
so warm
hype
by
you
your
up more than you
presence
deserve.
that my wife and children would wildly disagree with that statement.
Yeah,
They're
wife and
also
children
about
generally do
5 feet away. The kids just got home from school, so just
Oh,
hopefully
that's
they did not.
awesome.
Hopefully they did not overhear.
Oh man. Well, it's beautiful to be with you. Thanks for being with us on the launch team today. New York
No,
Times
thank
bestseller.
you,
That's
thank you, Strawn, for your time.
Yeah, it must feel pretty I know that from recent conversations you spent a long time working on this book. I know it's dear to your heart. For it to be received the way it's been received, I'm sure must just be a real gift to you this season of your life.
Yeah, I mean, the first thing I'd love to say is to all of you, and I wish I could see all of your faces. Just such gratitude in my heart that you would do whatever you've done to advocate for this new work. I'm so grateful. It's been an amazing 2 weeks. We actually hit the Times list again yesterday, so for 2 weeks in a row. So
Amazing.
that's a first for me, but I'm just mostly, it's amazing how little you feel in a moment like that. But what I do feel
Mm,
is gratitude in my heart. So deeply grateful to each one of you for your advocacy and kindness. But I think,
mm,
Strawn, I mean,
beautiful.
it's sold really well in the first 2 week ago, or so, but most people are just now starting to read it. So I am eager in the coming
Mm.
weeks and months and apprehensive at the same time to hear what's landing, what's not landing, how it's helpful or not.
Yeah.
That's the,
Yeah, it must be a strange feeling that this sort of like quote unquote product or this thing goes out, but it's not like a song where like someone just opens their Spotify and listens to the whole thing in 3 minutes. It's actually something that needs to be read and digested. It must be kind of like
yeah,
this weird silent period for you where it's out there,
yes.
people are reading it and then you're just waiting. Is that
Absolutely.
weird?
My wife's only on about page
Yeah.
60, so she's not in any hurry to read it through. So she's like, "It's great." I'm like, "You've only read like one part." So excuse me. So
Oh.
yeah, it does. You know what it's like. It does take time and it's scary to put yourself out there, but
Mm,
it's such an honor. I'm still a bit shocked
mm.
that anybody would read any of my thoughts, but very grateful.
Oh, man. Tell us about a little bit about the process. I know that this book's been on your heart for a while. Give us the kind of context for where it's come from and what it's been like putting this one together.
It's interesting. Forever ago, like one of the first things I did in pastoral work, excuse me, I'm recovering from a sickness,
Oh, good. Yeah.
was this would have been in the early 2000s. Started a college group in a living room with 6 people that kind of grew into, at the time, it was kind of common to have a church within a church model where we had a couple thousand college kids coming on a Friday night kind of thing. And, I'm just discovering who I was and what I was made to do. And from like very early on, I used to say, mostly to myself, that I feel a sense of call to help Christians become disciples of Jesus. And so this was years before I discovered the work of Dallas Willard. And when I read that
Mm,
iconic Willard line in The Great Omission, which is his play on the Great Commission of Matthew 28, go and make disciples, that if you've ever
mm,
sat through a teaching by me, there's a high likelihood I've said this at some point. But, he has that beautiful line. I think it's in the preface to the book. The greatest issue facing the world today is whether or not those who are identified as Christians will become disciples, students, practitioners, apprentices of Jesus.
mm,
And so when I first read that from Willard, I think it just struck this like tuning fork chord in my soul. But
mm,
that's a way of saying I think this book has been, people always ask like how long did it take you to write a book? And
mm,
I could not even answer that because, you know, writing the actual rough draft is just one small part of a book. And then most of what we
mm,
call writing is actually editing and rewriting, in little bits and pieces. But then all the
mm,
work that goes into, I mean, the hundreds of sermons that in some way formulated my thinking and got reformulated into a book over many years
mm,
later. And then all the life and, a therapy session, an experience, failure, a pain point, a conversation with my son. I mean, it's 8,000 things that all kind of go in together
mm,
to the formation of your inner person that eventually has some attempt to articulate, a worldview
mm,
or an idea. So my first research
mm,
file for this book was 2010. So when I started, to put it all together, I was shocked. I realized I've been taking notes, on this for 14
mm,
years, trying, because I knew early on I wanted to write something about this. And
mm,
books have played a large role in my formation. There was one in particular when I was in college that just imprinted on me. You know, some books you read and you're like, oh, that's great. And then you go on with your life. And then other books you read and like they imprint on you. They just have some
Mm,
deep effect on who you become. And I could not tell the story of my life without talking about mentors and people and books. And there was one, I'm sure many of you have read, called The Pursuit of God by A.W. Tozer. Beautiful book, short book. The legend is he wrote it in one train drive, sat down and I think it was Chicago to travel to St. Louis. And it was like an all-night train, and he just sat up with a cup of coffee and just wrote it by hand in one. I don't know if that's even true, but it's a nice idea.
amazing.
And it's a short book, and it imprinted on me this idea that we have to pursue God, to seek God, to find God, that it's not
Mm,
going to, you know, as Richard Foster would say, passively fall on your head. That
mm,
honestly, like that shaped my spirituality for a decade. That's still
mm,
in me. And it
mm,
really, I think, you know, set me up for my 20s for a real intentional pursuit of God. So that was one of my prayers for this book, man, of everything that I've learned over the years from Willard and so many others. And so much of this book is my intentional attempt to summarize and synthesize people
mm,
that have imprinted on me. I thought, man, if I could write something that would help someone wherever, whatever age they are, whatever stage they are, that could imprint this kind of mental model of I'm an apprentice of Jesus, following a way of life in community. That that's something I wish I had when I was getting started, and I would love to offer that. And by the
mm.
way, I'd love to
Well,
hear
right.
what those books
Well,
are for you in the chat. I'm seeing a Reaching Out, which is a lovely book, but would love to hear what those books have been for you.
nice. And the name of that A.W. Tozer book was Pursuit of God, wasn't it? Someone was asking
Correct. The
different.
Pursuit of God.
Um, just sidebar, I think you did meet your dream of articulating so well. I think the ache of the desire of the heart to meet with God and a roadmap for that. And I think some of the language that I notice that you do in the book and in your life is you've kind of distinguished between sort of being a Christian and becoming an apprentice of Jesus. Talk to us a little bit about that, because it sounds to me like maybe in that is this thing of like an apprentice seeks.
Mm-hmm.
I know it's broader than that for you, but like this Christian maybe is just like, this is what I believe. But what's the difference in your mind between a Christian and an apprentice, and why do you think it matters so much?
Yeah, I mean, if you read the book, I mean, I'll just repeat that. But, you know, the word Christian, Strahan, you know, this is only used 3 times in the New Testament. It's always used in the
Mm-hmm.
negative. It's like basically a religious epithet. I mean, it's a cruel word in the New Testament that later, after the close of the canon, was kind of repicked up by followers of Jesus who began to self-identify as, yes, we're Christians. It kind of means like it was a slur, but it kind of meant like wannabe Messiah or little Christ or wannabe Jesus. Christian,
Mm-hmm.
and they later, you know, picked that up and said, yes, we want to be like Jesus. We want to be little Christ, little Christians, and you know that's beautiful. But the word used, there's two like very dominant. There's lots of words used for to identify who we are as the people of God in the New Testament, but the two dominant ones are mathetes, or apprentice, disciple, practitioner, student, follower. However, the word literally means learner. I like apprentice as the
Mm-hmm.
best translation. Disciple is the most common one, or follower. And adelphoi, which in the old translations was translated brethren, and it means sibling, brothers and sisters. It's not a gendered
Mm-hmm.
word. And so family and apprentices to the rabbi, like those are the two dominant, we all live from mental models, every single one of us. Those are the two dominant mental models in the New Testament. But the word Christian, which is not really a word in the New Testament, barely at all, has taken on a totally different meaning over time. So prior to maybe the last 5 years, that word in America essentially meant someone whose mental models of reality would roughly map onto something, you know, roughly approximating a Judeo-Christian worldview, and who would maybe attend church on some regular basis. That may be twice a year at Christmas and Easter. and attempt to be a good person. That's kind of all that word meant, which is why like evangelical
Mm,
Christians became back in the day when I was a kid, a way of trying to communicate, people that are really seriously following Jesus. And now that is not remotely what that word means anymore. And now both of those words,
mm,
evangelical, which is not remotely a biblical word, so I have zero loyalty to that word, and the word Christian, which is, has a much richer heritage, both of those words have lost that meaning. So I read the other day
mm,
a news article, was an interview with a white supremacist who identified as an evangelical Christian, but he has never read the Bible and has never attended church once in his life. So I'm like,
mm,
whatever you mean by evangelical Christian, this is not like what it meant in the 80s when I was a little boy.
mm,
So that's all that word means. Whereas, the word disciple, apprentice, practitioner means one who has built their whole life around apprenticing under Jesus. And so
mm.
I had a provocative line in the book that did not survive editing. There's lots of things that did not survive editing in this book, a lot. But one, I had a line that the wiser than me editorial team said, no, you can't say that. But I had a line like, what if Jesus wasn't a Christian? And I was just trying to poke the bear a little bit. But what did survive editing almost did not. But I love, how my Catholic brothers and sisters, and hopefully some of you are on the call right now, distinguish between Catholics and practicing Catholics. The former is like just kind of
Mm,
almost like an ethnic or a social category. Like, guy's a good old Catholic boy. I don't know. I mean, like he's from Boston and has a lot of kids or whatever. Um,
mm,
whereas a practicing Catholic is a measure of devotion. It has nothing to do with where you're from or your ethnicity,
mm,
your cultural background, or the size of your family. It would mean, you're at daily mass and you're praying the rosary and you're practicing contemplative prayer, whatever it is, you're serving the poor. You're a practicing Catholic. I think it's time
mm,
for Protestants to adopt something like that. It could be,
mm,
Christian and practicing Christian, or it could be
mm.
Christian and disciple of Jesus.
Yeah, beautiful. And I think I first came across the language of apprenticeship through your work, John, like some time ago, maybe when we met in New Zealand back in
Hmm?
pre-COVID, 6,000 years ago, whenever it was, it feels like forever. And that word for me, apprentice, that really landed it because I'd heard of people talking. I knew about the word disciple, but it's so otherworldly, that language of discipleship. It's so I mean, it's a beautiful word, but it's to me, it's like a theological word because I don't usually walk around saying, "Oh, look, there's the disciple of whoever." And I
Mm,
think that that language of apprenticeship really helped for me shift from identify as a Christian, sort of that broader language into I'm actually putting the onus on myself. Like I'm following a particular way. I'm learning. I'm engaging. That's actually going in my life. And I think that language is so helpful. And I
yes.
love that piece about the practicing Catholic in the book. When I read that, I was like, yes, I feel exactly the same. It's just it feels like the moment demands this sense of, yeah, I'm a practicing Christian
Yes.
or whatever.
And what we were
Um,
trying to measure there, I mean, you have to be tricky with this because you don't want to have people go around. This is a helpful self-diagnostic. It's not a helpful, others judgment,
yeah,
contempt, oh,
yeah,
they're not a disciple, they're just a Christian or whatever. It's not helpful.
yeah.
I mean, maybe in the right context, but I think what's important to clarify is that the measurement here is not elite versus ordinary. The disciples like the
Mm,
elite follower of Jesus, and the Christians like just the ordinary person who's got like kids and a job and is just trying to figure it out. The measure
mm,
is not about maturity, it's about level of devotion. So, and you
mm,
might be, I mean, look at
mm,
the apprentices in the New Testament. They're an absolute disaster. You know what I mean? I mean, read about
mm.
the 12, and those are like the subgroup of apprentices that Jesus chose to become apostles and like carry the work
Yeah,
forward. And they're a disaster. They're a disaster. They're like Peter is a walking foot and mouth. They're arguing about who's the greatest up until like the death of Jesus. So it's not a measure of spiritual maturity, it's a measure of spiritual
mm,
commitment. But all 12
mm,
of them, even Judas, they left everything to apprentice under Jesus.
mm,
So I think, it's a
mm,
self-diagnosis tool, not a judgment tool. And the goal isn't to
mm,
measure how mature or enlightened or emotionally sophisticated you are, though hopefully all of that would come in time. It's to measure
mm,
like what is the animating center of my life and what am I actually committed to? Is it Jesus or is it my career or my family or my body or health and wellness or sex or pleasure
mm,
or fame or, whatever, travel. I mean,
mm,
that's what we're trying
mm,
to, and that's how it's used in the Gospels with, I talk about the distinction between disciples and the crowd. It's used to try to goad the reader into getting out of ambiguity and answering a hard question. Am I an apprentice of Jesus, ready to take that step? Or am I facing the crowd?
mm,
Or worse, am I like the many people that were super interested and came into dialogue with Jesus, but then like the rich young ruler, one translation of the Greek, because he went away with a face like a gray sky because he just
mm.
could not accept the price of entry to discipleship.
Yeah, and I love what you're saying before about like what we're giving ourselves over to, whether it's entertainment or career or sex or whatever, and the sense of like our moving and like the time we spend in that or what we give to it actually shapes us. And you're saying this statement in the book, which is actually, I think it's a really bold statement, and I loved it. And when I read it, it was just so well articulated that spiritual formation isn't necessarily a Christian thing or even a religious thing. It's a human being thing. um just what is like I'm thinking like I'm waking up in the morning, I'm thinking about my life in New Zealand, my family, everything that's going on. Tell us about that spiritual formation being a human thing and what that looks like, maybe even a few examples of that in daily life and how we're being shaped or formed.
Mm. I think, Strawn, I don't know if this has happened for you, but I have had such a paradigm. I'm very aware of the limitations of just talking about ideas, like to produce change.
Yeah.
But yet everything begins with talking and thinking about ideas. And one paradigm shift for me has been kind of moving from a moral model of discipleship to more of a formational model. And what I mean by that is, I think
Mm,
growing up in a very conservative, evangelical kind of house, which I'm grateful for, not bitter about that at all. But I think, and my personality matrix, which is very kind of rigid at times, and moralistic and judgmental at times. I think my default was to view things through the lens of, is this wrong or right? Is this okay or not okay?
mm,
So I grew up in a house where I
mm.
didn't realize till I was like a teenager that PG did not stand for pure garbage. We had no TV, no cable, none of that. And so like Christians who
Wow.
watched R-rated movies were just like up there with Christians that drank alcohol and worshiped Satan. Like those things just did not go together. And honestly, I'm really
Wow.
grateful for that. I have no regrets that I don't think I needed to be doing any of that crap when I was a kid.
Mm,
But that kind of mindset of like, is this wrong or right? That's kind of how I like came at it and approached it. I think the formational model is so much better. Not that we don't need to ask,
mm,
is something wrong or right or biblical or against the teachings of Jesus? But in the huge list of things that's gray, let's just start with this thing right here. Um, you know,
mm,
what is this forming in me? And it might not be things that are
mm,
morally wrong at all. For example, this is a weird one, unique to me, not to most listening, but I've realized I am regularly in these one, like right now, Strawn, you're my friend. And in any other situation, I would see you and I would start by asking questions. And if said hello to me by mentioning how many times I hit the New York Times list, I would like hang up on you, or you wouldn't do that. You'd mock me from the scene. You'd gently tease me.
yes.
But it's really weird when I'm like right now, we have book come out. I'm doing all these podcasts, all these interviews where a friend of mine says a word or two and asks a question, and then I just monologue for 5 or 10 minutes, and everybody else just listens.
Mm,
Now that's not morally wrong. Like this, there's a time and a place for it. But I worry, like, what is this doing to me? It's certainly not forming me in humility, being slow to speak
mm,
and quick to listen, being a good listener, putting others ahead of my own.
mm,
Like it's not forming that in me. It's forming, how am I getting used to, I'll find myself sometimes sitting around the table with friends and I'll have an interesting idea and I'll just assume I should like wow the table with my insight about the church fathers or whatever. And I'm like, no, like a godly person would probably listen and ask a question and just keep his idea to himself and write a book about it
mm,
someday, you know? So my point is, like this very, like, I'm just aware that this 1 hour Zoom session is an honor and I'm grateful, but it's also probably doing something that's just a light deformation on my soul. And there's a time for that. It's like food, like we'll have sugar on the Sabbath. Sugar is poison. It's terrible for my body. And I'll have a big bowl of ice cream tomorrow night. And that's okay. But if I was having ice cream 4 times a day, we'd have a serious problem. My body can kind of cleanse
Yeah,
out
yeah.
most of that if it's periodic. So all that to say, the key idea in the book, without trying to just rehash what I've already written there, is that everything we do, every relationship we're in, every moment, including this one right now, every habit, every line item in our budget, every movie we watch, every time we open up our phone, every time we exercise or don't exercise, all of this is forming us. Every attitude, every thought we think, every emotion we let fester in our body, every attitude we adopt, whether it's of gratitude or contempt or wonder or impatience, every one of these, like they form us. They do something to turn this inner fulcrum of our being, but so slightly and so incrementally that often we don't connect the dots between I'm doing this, it's making me more this over a long period of time until we've been deformed to such a level. It's the frog and water thing that we realize it,
Yeah. Yeah, and I love you've said this before, this whole idea of like look down the barrel of your life. If you just took your daily habits today and said, if I just extrapolate this over 20 or 30 years, who will I be at the end of that? Like what change may or may not take place? What will have informed me most? What will have dominated most of my time? That's a terrifying exercise from time to like I probably come back to this maybe every couple of months. I look at my life because I kind of go in cycles. Like I find that I'll go through really disciplined periods and then say book launch or family travel trip or sickness, and then you kind of get the speed wobbles. You get out of it again for like a month, and then you're like, well, I got to kind of ease back in. And so I find myself rechecking using that framework that you suggest of like, how is this going to extrapolate out if I'm just always sleeping in or if I'm eating this way, whatever. Um, and it's massive. And I think for me, I love two things about what you were just saying that really speak to me is the moralism thing is so huge. But I just think so many of us struggle not to see God in the sense of, is he pleased with me or unpleased with me? Is this right or is this wrong? Like, am I a good person or am I a bad person? Which aren't necessarily not real questions, but the framework is constantly about belief. It's sort of trying to categorize faith in terms of how we understand it. And I think so many people struggle to move out of that. And what I hear about you kind of even talking about this hour is, what would you say the question, like an alternative question, maybe, is this right or wrong? Would it be like, is this drawing me near to God? Or is this shaping me in God's love? Or like, what would be an alternative question in your mind to, is this right or is this wrong? Thinking about it in terms of formation. Oh yeah, I don't know if
That's a
you've gone
good
or if
question,
I've gone.
Strahan. I think you broke up there for a minute. I don't know if it's on your
That
end or
was me.
mine.
Okay,
Can everybody hear me?
sorry.
Maybe a couple of you. It's okay. I'm just happy to be with you. It's a great, the question came through. I'm getting lots of thumbs
Cool.
up. Um,
Great.
so I think one thing that would be helpful to clarify, Strawn, is we probably all, this would be an interesting like prayer reflection exercise for those of you listening. We probably all have some default metric that we run our decision kind of matrix through. So for me, my personality, raised in a conservative Christian home with a very kind of elder brother, rule following, moralistic, judgmental, self-righteous kind of personality. My default one is this wrong or right, right? Which is tied to a deep fear of, am I bad or good? But yours might be totally different. Like I'm thinking all the Enneagrams, like that's not my oldest son. That is not, I do not think that's his primary grid. A lot of it's like, do I want to do
Okay.
this or not? Does this sound fun or not? So that for a lot of people I know, their grid they make decisions through is
Mm,
like, does this sound fun or not? Other people might
mm,
make the decision through the grid of relationship. Will this bring peace to relationships or cause upset? So I think it would be good if you just kind of knew what your default,
mm.
metric was. And it's probably not bad. It's probably there is a time and a place for me to ask, is this morally right or is this morally wrong? And is this
Yeah.
disobedience or obedience? That's not a bad question. But it just doesn't answer for a lot of choices that I have to make. And there are other better
Mm,
questions. So, I mean, as far as to your question, I think for all of us at some level, we want to define, in, as the Greeks would say, the telos, the end goal. What's
mm,
the end? Or like, where do we want to end up? And that's where, in my mind, the telos for an apprentice of Jesus is the vision of life as articulated by Jesus, specifically in places like the Sermon on the Mount or Paul's work in Galatians 5 and his, list of the fruit of the Spirit, or you could go Romans
mm,
12, or you could go Pete. I mean, there's other kind of examples you could pull from, or Psalm 23 and or Psalm 1. I mean, there's
mm,
different places you can pull from, but that's the vision of I want to become this kind of person through deepening union with the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit. And is this
mm,
behavior moving me toward that or away? And again, a
mm,
lot of these things don't have clear answers. Sometimes the answers change based on your stage of life or your emotional need
mm,
at the moment. But I think that's the
mm,
ultimate. Just what I'm trying to do with the book is get people to think about their death, get people to think before it's too
mm.
late. I'm using this. Can I just nerd out on you and see if I can drop this image in the chat? Let's see if this even works. If it doesn't work, we won't do this. Uh, looks like it's not going to work. Oh, I have this thing image. Literally, my poor assistant had to like go buy it today. I can't get it. Never mind. I'm teaching on community this week for the Bridgetown Rule of Life teaching series. And I'm opening with this like haunting image. You could probably Google it of John Paul Getty. Do you know who that is as a New Zealander? Probably you know who like Rockefeller is probably Getty.
Oh, yeah. Yep. Yep.
And so we moved to LA, and not far from where we live is the Getty Villa. He has like one of the largest museums in the world. That's a real cultural legacy. And there's this spot called the Getty Villa, right close to where I live. That is insane. I mean, this is like rich person enlightenment kind of thing. But he was the richest man in the world in his lifetime. And he built this reconstruction of a villa that archaeologists unearthed at Pompeii, like an ancient Greco-Roman villa, he, like rebuilt it.
Oh, wow.
You can go tour it, and it's full of his lifelong collection of art. Never even saw it finished,
Yep.
much less lived there with the family. But I found this image of him, miserable person. The more wealthy and successful he became, the more miserable and miserly he became. And his movie's been made about him. He's the one who his grandson was kidnapped and he refused to pay the ransom. And at the
Oh,
end of
yeah.
his
Yeah.
life, yeah,
Seen that.
richest man in the world. At the end of his life, he's like stressed out about medical bills and all of this stuff. But I found this image of him right before he died in the 1960s, I think, at Sutton Palace in the UK, which is like a palace that he owned in the English countryside. And it's him at this like 20-foot long table covered in gold, like literal gold plating, silverware, I mean, rich tap, I mean, opulent wealth. And he is at the very end of the table in a suit, sitting, eating totally alone. And
Mm,
his wife wrote a memoir about their marriage and called it Alone Together. Not exactly what you want to hear from your wife. And I just thought it
gosh.
was such like a haunting, I think it's such a haunting symbolic image of the fallout of
Mm,
radical individualism. So much the
mm,
progressive life script that in Portland or now LA just is everywhere and most of the internet dominates is all dominated by people under the age of 40. And so it's so sad. People don't have the ability to extrapolate out, say, hookup culture or not getting married or whatever, to
Mm,
extrapolate it out to what does this look like when you're 70 years old, 80 years old, 90 years old?
mm,
And all of
mm,
this begins to catch up with you. So looks like there's some links there. But
mm.
my point is,
Oh, great.
I think if we can be thinking that way, both with a sobering reality and with a hopeful, like, oh, who could I become at 90 years old? I would love to help people think that way.
Mm, yeah, beautiful. I mean, I feel like there couldn't be a better sort of anti-gospel image if I think about book of Luke and Matthew and just the constant invitation of Jesus to a banquet table of the poor and the lonely and the widowed, and that
Wow.
kingdom of heaven is this feast, and this feast that God puts on, and there's this beautiful image of this very rich, successful, has everything in the world guy who's sitting at a table on their own is
Mm, gosh, I've
quite
not
a
even thought about
profound
that.
sort of
It is like
anti-image.
the anti-image to the Abrahamic feast, huh? Wow.
Yeah, pretty profound. And I
Wow.
wonder, like, because on that note, actually, you talk about in the book, um, that sort of formation is about taking things away. So I'm just thinking in terms of this guy's wealth and everything, that a lot of it is actually about subtraction, I think is the language
Yeah.
used, not addition. Um, how does less is more then speak to that ultimate destiny of union with God, living life right, thinking about death, getting it right, daily life, discipleship, subtraction, not addition? What does that look like at sort of a daily level for you, or how does that kind of concept bear out in the book?
I mean, I think it's helpful to think about there are some problems that we solve for, and then there are other tensions that we manage. And I
Mm,
think whenever you delve into hurry, over busyness, how do we simplify our life, slow down, focus on what matters, not be hurried, there are some problems you can solve for. Like there are some like clear, immediate crash course, pragmatic stuff you can do. Digital Sabbath, morning
mhm,
prayer, practice of Sabbath in general, simplifying your wardrobe. It's a couple of these things you can do. Not sleeping by your phone. It's like a bunch of pragmatic stuff you can do right away. But even if you do all that stuff, I mean, you still live in this world, and you may, like me, have three teenagers, or like you have like rambunctious boys, breaking through the walls all the time and having a blast, and
mhm.
jobs and careers, and we're trying to make a living, and like pay rent or pay the
Mm,
mortgage or whatever, obligations, service calling, neighbors that need things at inconvenient times. Like life still happens to you. And so it
yeah.
was so helpful for me. I noticed emotionally healthy spirituality was one of the repeats in books that I've imprinted, and it would be the same for me. But it was so helpful to me when Pete, is the author of that, clarified once that emotional health is not the same thing as emotional happiness. So to say you're emotionally healthy doesn't mean you're never unhappy, never stressed out, never, that's not what it means. It's
Mm,
not, in which case none of us are emotionally healthy. Emotional
mm,
health is more about like you're aware of your feelings, you can notice them, you can name them, you have emotional regulation, you realize where they come from, you're living an
mm,
embodied way of life designed to support a healthy emotional flourishing and development. But you still have moments of cross pressure that just come. So all that to say,
mm,
yes, obviously a major theme of my life and work is this is about subtraction, not addition. It's about, pursuing
mm,
simplicity, not increasing complexity. It's about less, not more.
mm,
It's about slowing down and, warring against hurry with every member in your being. But I will be the first to tell you, I mean, never write a book about eliminating hurry if you're a hurried person, because you will for the rest of your life just live in shame. I've had a horribly hurried day today. I was working on a sermon that should have been a 2-day project that due to a offsite with our team was a 1-day project. when I had to check my text messages for something, and I found out that I had a meeting this afternoon that required 2 hours of preparation for the meeting that wasn't on my calendar. And I was like, ah, so like, that's my day. That just happens. And I had a meeting I had to prepare for and a sermon I had to write. And so I just had to cram it
Mm,
together and, not spend as much time as I would have wanted. It was just horribly stressful. And that just
mm,
happens. It's just
yeah.
that there's no version of life where you're not managing that tension. So I think the moral of that
Mm,
story is not so screw it and just go live a hurried life. The moral is, listen, don't add shame on top of the horrible feeling of hurry and
mm,
stressing your body. That's not going
mm,
to be helpful long term. But
mm, mm,
accept emotionally and peacefully, this is going to be a challenge. This is going to be something I fight probably until the day I die, and
mm.
it's still a fight worth 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 fighting.
Yeah, yeah, it's beautiful, man. If I if I'm hearing you right, and forgive me if I'm not, I'm going to use my language to kind of just
Yes, please, 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 because
kind of make sense that
I just talked at you for 5 more minutes. So like,
no,
help with
not
the
at all. No, no.
help
I love what you're
help
saying,
reform
and
me a little bit here.
it speaks a little bit to something that I've been processing in my own life. Is that there's two elements, this kind of unhurrying, which has these tones of minimalism, but with like a Matthew 5, 6 kind of overlay of Jesus' teaching of what it means to be goodly human. Some of it's just real practical stuff, like don't book back-to-back meetings 13 hours a day every day without Sabbath, that kind of thing,
Right.
which is great. So the stuff we're in control of, that external stuff. Then there's like a second element, which is our internal world, which is hurried by our shadows, by our upbringing, by personalities and our living, that is actually contributes to like an internal hurriedness, which is maybe actually just things like shame or fear or guilt, that even if we're living a minimalistic life, we're still actually internally, it's like we're just going nonstop all the time, which is something I've experienced moving from a large city to a small town. I was like, I thought I was unhurried in the city, and now I live in a small town, and I'm like, oh, okay, so there is a lot more going on inside. Um, and then that third element, if I hear right, is that life happens. Like life is life. I mean, look at the life of Jesus. He didn't live a perfectly cordoned off schedule. His life was full of interruptions that you could almost say a hurry, except of his approach to it was something else. He managed to flow with it in such a way that maybe because of his internal processing and going through that emotionally healthy journey, in his own way, as a first century rabbi, whatever, was able to be present to those moments, to live in acceptance, to live in trust. And so if I'm hearing you right, there's sort of three stages of subtraction are, yes, physical subtraction life. Also, sometimes you do have three young rambunctious boys and you get sick or you get workday meetings, and actually your internal hurry is a sort of a longer journey of processing your emotional health and life. And so subtraction in that sense could actually just be dealing with the soul and who we are and reckoning with it and becoming aware so that we can respond in an
Mhm.
unhurried manner. Is that
Yeah.
is that kind of fair? I think that's what I'm hearing what you're saying.
Well, I could not agree more. I think that's better articulated than I had it. And yeah, Ortberg has that line, which I quote in my previous book: "Hurry is not just a sign of a disordered schedule; it's a sign of a disordered heart." And
Man,
and I think he's
stings. That stings.
so it stings. He's so right, and it's really interesting what you say. Like, yeah, exactly. My day today is not that hurried externally, in the sense of, I'll be done with work by 6 p.m. I didn't start at
Mm-hmm.
3:30 in the morning or anything. And I had I had time for prayer. I had time to exercise in the middle of the day. But internally, it was really hurried, probably because, of my perfectionism, of my frustration when, I work from home, when people get in the
Yeah.
way, when I'm late for a meeting or whatever. And I'm like, hey, I need you out of the bathroom.
Mm-hmm.
I need a shower, that kind of thing. And I
Yeah.
think what you just articulated has been exactly my experience. And it was really, honestly, hard and sobering. It was difficult for me to accept when I first began to dawn on me. It's like I had this hurried, maxed out life that I wrote about in The Ruthless Elimination of Hurry. And I realized there's this whole concept of rule of life and
Mm-hmm.
practices for slowing and pragmatic, concrete counter habits that we can adopt to resist the digital empire and Babylon and all of that. And that's still 1,000%. It's a huge part of my work is trying to help people figure that out and implement it in their own life. But then that moment, Strawn, when I realized what you just said, that there's this whole band of like pragmatic, embodied, physical stuff that you got to do, practices and counter habits and digital
Mm,
resistance and a digital rule of life and slowing. There's this whole band, a rule of, let's just call it rule of life. But then, even if you do all of the things, there's this whole internal thing that is way less under your control. That is way you can't habit
mm,
stack your you can't habit stack your way through. And
mm,
it's dealing with all the shadow stuff of why am I so hurt? It's ambition, it's fear, it's ego, it's father wounds,
mm,
it's lack of self-awareness, it's
mm,
drivenness, it's discontentment, it's financial anxiety, it's ambition, it's like
mm,
all
mm.
this stuff that's actually the emotional engine behind our hurried lives. And that's one of the
Yeah.
reasons I believe so much in practices like Sabbath and solitude and more contemplative
Mm,
stuff, because it makes space for this stuff to come into our awareness, even though it's not pleasant.
yeah.
At first, you go through it and then it is pleasant, but it makes
Mm,
space for it to come up and us to realize, oh, um, I'm really anxious about money right now. And I'm
mm.
realizing I just said yes to doing these three things, not because I was meant to do them, but because
Because you're
I'm
worried.
anxious
Yeah.
and I need to make some more
Yeah.
money in order to be okay. And that's not
Mm,
rational. That's a deep, wounded, messed up part of me.
yeah. Yeah.
And like to
Yeah.
have spaces where that comes up in solitude and in close relationships, I think it's really important.
That's the space. Yeah, I'm with you, man. I think I preferred it was much easier in my younger years and younger faith when my understanding of sin was when I cheated on an exam or didn't pay enough on something or just
Totally.
cussed too bad. And then you kind of get through that stuff. You kind of tame the tongue, and then you're like, whoa, I've got these patterns of anger that just sit behind the surface, or my tendency to negative thought, and these things are kind of much more
Whew.
terrifying. But anyways, I've just
This is
seen a
the work,
ton.
man. This is the work.
Um,
This is the
this is
work
the work.
of following
A
Jesus.
couple of questions for you from a few people who have messaged in, and then I just want to see if I can get to a couple on the Q&A. So we've got
Great.
about 12 minutes left, I think.
Great.
Um, let's have a look here. Ariel asks, what advice would you give to a parent of small children who struggles to integrate spiritual practices such as silence, solitude, and fasting?
Mm. Oh man, so many thoughts. One is just celebrate small wins. So if you're solitude, it's
Mm,
not a solitude day retreat, it's like 5 minutes or 15 minutes while little Johnny or whoever is napping. Celebrate that. Secondly, read Domestic Monastery by Ronald Rolheiser. It's written for young parents. You can read it in 30 minutes. It's
mhm.
perfect for young
Great
parents.
book.
And he articulates better than I would be able to how the chaos and busyness of raising little kids in particular can be your kind of monastery. It can long
Mm,
term form you in the same way that if you were to practice 4 hours of contemplative prayer a day, it would. He tells this great story about this famous Italian monk that went into a hermitage for 30 years and basically spent 3 decades in solitude, and then came back and spent time with his Italian mother, who was a mother to six, who'd just been raising 6 kids while he was away praying, and realized that not only was she more loving than him, but she was also more contemplative. And that something about the way she'd been parenting in the chaos of life had formed her into a contemplative person of love. So let it be your monastery. Accept the season of life. God, that Willard line, God only meets us to bless us where we actually are. So your spiritual formation can't
beautiful.
start once your kids are all in grade school and you can spend proper time for devotional life. Your spiritual life has to
Yeah.
start now. And then third thing I would say is, you have to be careful with that, because we don't want to then say, so don't spend any time alone in prayer. Like that's not what I'm saying. And that's where we really need community. Hopefully you're in a family unit and a marriage, and hopefully that marriage is inside a larger multi-generational family and wider web of kinship and community. That is, of course, the Jesus ideal, and it's not the reality for a lot of people. But to whatever degree, whether you have it and you're like, oh no, my grandparents live up next door and my cousins across the street, and we all do life together, beautiful. Or you're like, no, I'm a single mom and I have nobody. Wherever you are, the goal is to move toward building community and then leaning on community to help each other, at a marital level, family level,
Mm,
community
mm.
level, kinship level. Really, do all you can to help each other in that way.
That's beautiful. Yeah. And I second Domestic Monastery, just an amazing book. And I think too, like God created families. He knows, I mean, lots of those Old Testament families are huge. It's not like God doesn't know the precious. And so I think if God had created us to live in a world in which we needed, to live have all this ample time, families wouldn't have been a great model. So I think underneath it for me is, and what you're saying, John Marcus, how
Yes.
can I let this model form me in my response to it as well, which is pretty cool.
Yeah.
Um,
Somebody here is mentioning the story about Susanna Wesley, who's John Wesley's mom, who the story goes, used to pull her apron
yeah,
over her head to pray. And the kids knew
yeah,
to try not to bug her when her apron was over her. It's an old school example, but like, that's just
isn't that
real
amazing?
life. That's real life.
Yeah,
And she turned out a
it's
John
so
Wesley.
good.
So what can you say?
Yeah, she
And
didn't
Charles
do
Wesley.
too bad. A few people have asked this in the chat as well, but Carolyn asked, will there be a leadership guide for pastors? We're a very small church and would love to implement this discipleship program.
I mean, if you go to practicingtheway.org, which is not for the book, it's for the organization that we've started. Yeah, there's a ton of stuff. And we have our first ever, the Practicing the Way course is coming in March, end of March, in time for Easter. It'll be an 8-session kind of course it's not just a book study, though you can read the book along with it, and we encourage that. But it's legit own 8-week offering, primer on spiritual formation. It will have all sorts of stuff for leaders, pastors, training, all that kind of stuff. We're working on in-depth training right now. And then, yeah, if you just go to the pastors page at practicingtheway.org, which is just beginning to get built out, we have a ton more coming. So maybe revisit it in the months to come. We are working really hard to create conferences, gatherings, Q&Rs, coaching for pastors to implement this kind of a discipleship pathway.
Beautiful. Great. Okay, so I got 2 more questions for you. One is a little question that I'm just choosing because I'm interested in it too. And then the second one's a big question. So we'll just give a little answer to the first one. Genevieve asks, will there be a potential book or podcast series on life in the spirit and then prophetic gifts? Love that section of the book.
Oh, that's awesome. Yeah, no, nothing in the works right now. I mean, I've done a lot of teaching on that at the past at Bridgetown that you can visit through the Bridgetown podcast. Tyler, my successor there, is writing a book on the Holy Spirit right now that I'm just did a light editing pass or just beta reader pass with him on, and it's better than anything I would do. So yeah, nothing that I'm planning right
Cool.
now to write about that, but Strahan hopefully will. Tyler is. Many other good voices that are offering deeply helpful things in that aspect.
Awesome. There are some pretty heavy hitting questions in this Q&A, but a lot of them, just kind of scrolling through, guys, are about models of church, and in particular sort of mega churches, and kind of bringing this into that kind of church context. So that's the background for the specific question, but I think in there seems to be a broader wrestle with what do we do with the church model we've got? How do we bring this in, especially in a mega church context? But maybe as a way of kind of bringing that in, Jasha asks, do you have any ideas about to what models of doing church will become most effective in America in the future? What implications does this have for the megachurch culture? So maybe in behind that is just a question of what does this mean for us in our churches today, which I know is a really, really massive question, but maybe a thought you might have
Yeah,
on that.
gosh, there's lots we could say there, Strawn. I'm gonna discipline myself to not say a lot of what I think there because I have, all these ideas. Strawn and I have been dreaming about starting some kind of newer type of community that's significantly different than not just a mega church, but a traditional Sunday-based church. It's a little bit more like a order or a Orthodox updated Quaker meeting than it is like a rock concert or whatever. But there, and I have
Mm.
lots of clear ideas that I talk about and think about every day, but I haven't tested them yet, and I don't want to be the person that offers specific critiques and vague, untested
Mm.
solutions.
Mm.
So I think as a general rule, there's no right model of church. I used to think that like there's got to be a right model, and then if we can nail that, then we'll do it. I think there's no right model of church. I think Keller had a really good, model of like what he called a gospel ecosystem. And he would say every church needs a house church network and neighbor churches, and every church should have a mega church. And I agree with that. I'm sorry, every city should have a mega
Mm.
church. And you need nonprofits and ministries of mercy and spiritual direction training and cohorts for formation and monasteries and retreat centers. Like every city and region should have a kind of ecosystem of the Church of Jesus. And I think the key, there's no right model of church. There's some that I
Mm.
would be much more enthused about than others. And I think as a general rule, the larger a church gets, the less enthused I am about it. But that doesn't mean that I think large churches are wrong or
Mm.
bad or don't play a key role. I think it's imperative to know the pros and cons of whatever model you're in. So if you're in a house church, which we're about to start a house church here in LA, if you're in a house church, you should know, man, there's some huge pros. We know each other, we're in each other's lives, we're doing life together, we're around a table. And, my kids don't have access to a larger village. And if three people move away, this whole
Mm.
thing might implode because there's no larger superstructure. And how are we getting teaching? And who's going to actually call us to a higher level of discipleship when we're all kind of living this very harmonized, egalitarian life together? So it's just good to know here's the pros, here's the cons. And megachurches and congregational churches and Anglican churches, and Pentecostal churches all need to think the same way. What are the pros? What's the light and what's the shadow? What are the challenges of this model?
Mm.
The challenge that I see is so few so few pastors and churches are willing to be honest about the underbelly or the shadow of their model of church. And
Mm.
which then, rather than mitigating against it, enables that shadow to grow. And the thing that bothers me a
Mm.
lot is there's so little pastoral imagination in America. So there's a lot of 100-person churches trying to be 10,000-person Hillsongs or whatever. And they're just like,
Mhm.
this very bluntly, just not doing a very good job of it. And so people aren't coming like that. And that's just
Mhm.
very blunt. And I just think,
Mhm.
man, if I was a pastor of 70 people, I'd think, what can you do with 70 people that you cannot possibly do with 1,000 or with 500? Or what can you do with 1,000 that
Mm.
you cannot do with 30,000? Or what can you do with 30 that you cannot do with 300? And those are really good questions.
Mm.
So I think the future will be, I think, definitely smaller. I think there'll be some, to keep it ambiguous, some world where it used to be that if you want to hear good preaching, you had to sacrifice community. There's an era in the church. You had to go sit in a building, and in order to get access
Mm.
to good preaching, you had to be a part of a super, super large church. Now all you have to do is like
Mhm.
podcast John Tyson. You don't need to be part of that church. And so
Mm.
a lot of church models are built to deliver as a delivery mechanism for preaching. And now the internet does that really, really well. And I'm not saying it's the same listening to a podcast as the spiritual discipline of being a part of a sermon in community in a place. That's much more
Mm.
powerful. But I do think there'll be more and more hybrid models where people utilize Bible Project and sermon podcasts for the kind of input of
Yep.
teaching and Christian theology and that mental map work that's so important to discipleship,
Yep.
which will enable them to have smaller churches. Like a good friend of mine that I just interviewed as we're thinking about a little community we want to start here has 50 people in a kind of glorified house church, and he sends out a 20-minute kind of sermon via email. And then Sunday morning they get together, they all do breakfast together, they have 3 discussion questions, the kids go with the babysitter, they break
Mm.
into triads, they talk through the kind of teaching that he sent out, and then they all come back and share what they've been learning from that passage and pray for each other, and then they play in the backyard. I'm like, that's awesome. That's like an
Mm.
innovative model of like he's still bringing in teaching
Mm.
scripture, but they're doing life together. And you can only do that with 30, 40, 50 people in a house with a big backyard in Southern California. You can't do that with a large church. And the same with, he can't do John Tyson level preaching and teaching in his context. That's not what his call is. So I think there'll be more hybrid models like that. I think the house church movement is finally not just reactionary. It used to be house church was just code for I hate mega churches. And now it's like, no, I'm running into all these people that are like, no, we just love each other and we want to do life together. And so I don't think there's a future. I think there's lots of different futures. And I hope that we see more and more pastoral imagination, that megachurches continue. Megachurches are incredibly helpful for non-Christians, new Christians, and extroverted younger people early in the spiritual journey. Incredibly helpful for those people. But the farther you get away from that, the more mature you are, the older you are, the less extroverted you are, the more the less and less traction that model of church seems to get in your life. And so we want to be careful of consumerism, but I do hope and pray we see more pastoral imagination. And I would love for Practicing the Way and some of the work we want to do down the road to contribute maybe just a tiny bit some of that pastoral imagination.
Beautiful, man. I love the heart. I love the vision. If I hear you right in that answer, there is a, hey guys, there's no silver bullet sort of answer to this where there's the thing. I love your sort of optimistic, hopeful take on the church as this biosystem. And I think too, I mean, some of the questions there are asking about bringing formation practices into the church. Obviously, Practicing the Way itself, the organization has these amazing resources that you can run with your group, with your leadership, as a way of bringing those in. And I noticed as well, Linda, talking about an interview with Carrie Newhoff. I hope I've pronounced that right, on the Leadership Podcast. I would also recommend really connecting with that. So that feels like a great place to kind of land on this kind of optimistic, beautiful vision for the future. On behalf of John Mark,
I'm just reading all these questions and realizing there's so many great thoughts and questions. And gosh, you're a lovely group of people. I'm sorry we ran out of time.
Yeah, sorry guys. Yeah, that's on me, man. You can send all your disgruntled emails to Strahan at somewhere for not getting through all your amazing questions. Thank you so much again for being part of this team. Thank you for supporting this book. Thank you for supporting John Mark. I have read this book. It moved me, even though I've immersed myself in John Mark's teachings and life for a while. And I'm grateful that you've kind of helped to bring that into the world. So thank you again. If you do want this link, we will send it out. If you missed any part of it, please do share the book with your friends. Enjoy reading it, and really grateful again for your time. And thank you, John Mark, for your time. Thanks for being with us and just being so vulnerable. I think I noticed a lot of comments, people just saying, thank you for your transparency and your honesty. It's an inspiration to us. So
all I have to offer, Strahan. It's not virtue. It's pragmatism. Strahan, would you pray? A couple of people have asked for a benediction. Would you bless those? And let me just say again, thank you so much to all of you for your advocacy on the launch team. We're just incredibly grateful and praying that this book does anything and everything that God wants it to do in the hearts of the church.
Yeah. Yeah, beautiful. Awesome. Okay. Well, let me pray and then we'll sign off. Father, we love you. We honor you. We glorify you. You have a beautiful vision for the church, a beautiful vision for the world. And here in this place, as a community, in this dialogue and in this book, you are offering us a crack in the door, a vision, a way to move through. And so we bless you, Lord. We thank you and pray that you would send us in the power of your Spirit to love, to know your love, and to express that love in the world as we turn our hearts, our bodies, and our minds towards you. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Amen. Thank you all. We will see you next time. Thanks again for joining.